Levi Rollins felt the grit of the trail in his teeth, a fine powder that had settled into every line on his face. For 3 months, the world had been dust, the bawling of cattle, and the hard, unyielding ground of the Montana Territory. Now, the spring drive was done. His pay, minus what he had sent to the bank in Miles City, was a heavy weight in his shirt pocket. His horse, a sturdy buckskin named Buck, plodded with its head low, just as weary as the man on its back. The town of Two Forks appeared in the V of the valley. Not a welcome sight, but a necessary one. Levi's homestead was another 2 hours north, set deep in the rocky hills where no one else had bothered to claim. It was isolated, which suited him. He had no love for the tight-lipped righteousness of Two Forks. The town was built on gossip and judgment, a place where a man's worth was measured by his attendance at Sunday service and the straightness of his fence posts. Levi's fences were strong, but he had not seen the inside of the church in 5 years. Not since Silas. He intended to ride straight through, pick up salt and flour from Miller's Mercantile, and be home before dusk. But a different habit pulled his reins. He guided Buck toward the small, clapboard church at the edge of town, its white paint peeling thin as an eggshell. Beside it stood the pantry, little more than a shed, where the widows of the parish collected alms. Levi never went inside. He would tie his donation, a sack of beans, smoked bacon, or coffee, to the hitching post, knock once on the door, and ride away. It was a duty, nothing more, a silent tax he paid for the sin of his own survival. He dismounted, the stretch in his legs painful. He unstrapped a heavy sack of flour from his pack mule. As he neared the pantry door, he heard a sound. Not the usual chatter of the churchwomen, but a small, sharp sound. A child's cough, quickly shushed. The door was ajar, letting a sliver of dusty afternoon light into the gloom. Curiosity was not a trait Levi cultivated, but the sound held a note of desperation that snagged him. He nudged the door wider. The smell of damp earth and root vegetables hit him. In the dimness, he saw her. He knew her, though it had been years. Annie Mae Harper. She had been Annie Mae Caldwell then, the preacher's daughter, with bright copper hair and a laugh that rang clear as a bell. She had been the town's darling. There was no bell in her now. She was huddled in the far corner, her back to the door, as if trying to hide herself in the shadows. 2 small children were with her, a girl, maybe 4 years old, and a boy a year or so older. They were perched on upturned potato crates. Annie Mae held a small, wooden box on her lap. It was a scraps box, the one the mercantile owner filled with day-old bread heels, bruised apples, and cold bits of sausage left from his own dinner. It was meant for the preacher's pigs. She was breaking a crust of dark bread and pressing it into her son's hand. He ate it with a desperate, animal quickness. She then gave a piece to the girl, whose hair was the same copper as her mother's, but lank and dull. Annie Mae herself was not eating. Levi stood frozen, a witness to a scene not meant to be seen. He took in the details, each one a small, sharp blow. The children's cheeks were hollow, their wrists like tiny sticks. Annie Mae's dress, a faded calico that had once been blue, was a map of careful patches. The thread itself was a different color, a stark white against the worn fabric. She was thin, a boniness to her shoulders that spoke of skipped meals and long nights. The boy, finished, looked at his mother. "More, Mama?" "Hush, Thomas," she whispered. Her voice was not a bell. It was a dry rasp, like leaves skittering on hard ground. "This is all. Be grateful for it." She felt the air change. A shadow had fallen across the floor. She stiffened, her hand flying to the box, as if to cover the evidence of her shame. Slowly, she turned. When her eyes met Levi's, he saw a storm of emotions. First, startled fear, then a wave of hot, deep humiliation that turned her pale cheeks crimson. She recognized him. Her gaze dropped instantly to the dirt floor. She could not look at him. She, the preacher's daughter, caught feeding her children pig scraps in the church pantry. Levi looked at her bent head, at the worn patch on her son's breeches, at the little girl's bare feet, blue with cold. He thought of the judgmental faces in the town's parlor windows. He thought of her father, Preacher Caldwell, who had thundered from the pulpit about sin and damnation, and who had publicly disowned his own daughter when her husband's crimes came to light. Annie Mae's husband, Jedediah Harper, had been a smooth-talking man with a taste for whiskey and cards. He had charmed the town, charmed the church elders, and then he had stolen the collection money. Not just a Sunday offering, but the entire fund meant to build a new roof. When his theft was discovered, he had fled, riding his horse straight into the swollen Spring Creek. They found his body a week later, tangled in driftwood, his pockets empty. The town, robbed of its justice, had turned its spite on his widow. They blamed her. They said she knew. They said she drove him to it. They whispered that the sin of the husband was a stain on the wife. She was cast out, left to starve on a worthless plot of land 2 miles out, in a shack that was little more than sticks and mud. Levi looked at her, and he did not see the gambler's wife. He did not see the preacher's daughter. He saw a woman being ground into the dirt by the same hypocrites who had probably spat on his own brother's name. He was not a man of many words. He lived in silence, cultivated it. But now, a feeling he could not name, not pity, but something harder, something like iron, rose in his chest. It pushed the words out of him before he had a chance to think them. "Get your things," Levi said. His voice was rough from the trail. Annie Mae's head snapped up, her eyes wide with confusion. "Get your things," he repeated, his voice flat, leaving no room for argument. "You're coming home." She stared at him as if he had spoken in a foreign tongue. "What, Mr. Rollins? I do not understand." "Your belongings. Pack them." She scrambled to her feet, pushing the scraps box behind her. The children huddled against her skirts. No, thank you. We are fine. We are just resting." The lie was plain, pathetic. "I said, get your things." "I cannot," she whispered, and the shame was replaced by a flash of her old pride, the preacher's daughter's pride. "I will not accept charity. Sir, we manage." "This is not charity, ma'am." Levi's gaze was steady. He looked past her, at the 2 small, frightened faces. He saw the hollows under their eyes. "This is a solution. You do not know what they say? You do not know what you would be inviting," she pleaded, her voice dropping lower. She was terrified of him, terrified of the town, terrified of this sudden, impossible offer. "My name, my husband." "I know your name," Levi said, cutting her off. He did not care about her husband. He did not care about the town. He saw a thing that was broken, and he had an instinct to fix it. Or perhaps he saw a fellow ghost, and he felt the pull of recognition. "I am not asking." He did not raise his voice. He did not threaten. He simply stood there, a tall, sun-scorched man in a dusty duster, his shadow filling the pantry. He had made up his mind. He was as stubborn as the granite hills his ranch was built on. He waited. The silence stretched. Annie Mae looked at him, her eyes searching his face for a trick, for malice, for the pity that felt worse than hunger. She found none of it. She found only a hard, unreadable certainty. She looked at her son, Thomas, who was watching Levi with a mixture of fear and wonder. She looked at her daughter, Sarah, who had begun to shiver. She looked at the half-eaten crust of bread in her hand. The fight went out of her. Her shoulders slumped, the pride breaking under the crushing weight of her reality. She was cold, she was hungry, and her children were starving. She had no more strength to pretend. She gave a single jerky nod. It was barely a movement at all, but Levi saw it. He turned without another word and walked back to his mule. He unhitched the cart he used for supplies. "Stay here," he told Buck, then led the mule and cart down the rutted track that led out of town. The one that ran past the tannery and toward the creek. He knew where she lived. Everyone knew. It was the place no one else wanted. He did not have to ask for directions. The shack was visible from the track, a sagging structure of mismatched boards and mud chinking. Leaning against the wind, the roof was patched with sod and rusted tin. It looked as if a strong breeze would send it tumbling into the gully below. She was waiting outside, the two children clinging to her hands. They had no coats. "Where are your things?" Levi asked. Annie Mae pointed inside. "We do not have a wagon, Mr. Rollins." "I brought the cart." He went inside. It took his eyes a moment to adjust to the gloom. The shack was one room. The floor was packed earth. In one corner, a pile of straw and two threadbare blankets served as a bed for all three of them. In another, a small, cracked stove, cold and dark, held a single, blackened pot. A broken crate held their possessions: a tin plate, two wooden cups, a comb with missing teeth, and a mending basket. That was all. Levi felt that iron bar in his chest twist. He had seen poverty on the trail, but this was a different kind. This was desolation. Wordlessly, he picked up the crate. Annie Mae gathered the blankets. The boy, Thomas, ran back to the straw pile and retrieved something. It was a small, wooden horse, its head broken off and missing, one leg splintered. He clutched it to his chest as if it were treasure. Levi loaded the pot, the stovepipe, and the crate into the cart. He laid the blankets down for the children to sit on. He did not have the stove itself. It was too heavy and likely worthless. He would give her the one from his bunkhouse. Annie Mae lifted Sarah into the cart. Then Thomas. She paused, her hand on the wooden wheel, and looked back at the shack. It was a miserable hovel, a place of shame and hunger. But it was the only home she had. She was trading it for what? She looked at the back of the tall, silent man in front of her. She was terrified. "Ma'am," Levi said, not turning. She climbed in and sat between her children, pulling the thin blanket over their legs. Levi clicked his tongue, and the mule lurched forward. The cart wheels groaned, settling into the ruts of the road. They left the shack behind without a backward glance. They rode north, away from Two Forks, into the vast, open country. The silence was immense, broken only by the plodding of the mule's hooves and the sigh of the wind. And the land? It rolled out before them, an ocean of pale grass, wind-bitten and raw. The mountains stood sharp against the sky, their peaks still holding snow, beautiful and indifferent. It was a hard country. It offered no comfort. It promised nothing but survival, and only to those strong enough to take it. Levi kept his eyes forward. What in God's name had he done? He had a ranch to run, fences to mend from the winter snows, stock to check. He lived alone. He preferred it. The silence of his cabin was a balm to the old, aching wound inside him. Now he was bringing a woman and two small children into that silence, a woman with a shamed name. The town would talk. They would say he was a fool, or worse. He glanced back. Annie Mae was staring straight ahead, her face pale, her hands clutched so tightly in her lap her knuckles were white. The children were huddled against her, their eyes wide, watching the unfamiliar landscape pass. They looked like three small, shipwrecked souls, adrift on a hostile sea. He turned back around. He had done it. He would see it through. As the sun began to dip, painting the sky in brutal streaks of orange and purple, they crested the last ridge. Levi's homestead sat below. It was not much, a small, sturdy cabin built of thick pine logs, a solid barn, and a web of corrals. It was a lonely place, tucked against the granite shoulder of a hill, sheltered from the worst of the north wind, but stark. He led the mule to the barn, unhitched the cart, and began to unsaddle Buck. Annie Mae did not move. She sat in the cart, watching him. "You can go inside," Levi said, his voice muffled as he heaved the saddle onto its rack. Stove is cold, but the wood box is full. She climbed down, her legs stiff. She helped the children out. Thomas still held his broken horse. Sarah clutched her mother's skirt. They walked to the cabin door as if walking to a jail cell. Annie Mae pushed it open. It was one room, like her shack, but it was solid. A man's room. Clean, but spare. A large iron bedstead stood in one corner. A thick wool blanket folded neatly on the mattress. A heavy table and 2 chairs stood in the middle. A cast-iron stove, larger than hers, was cold in the corner. Shelves on the wall held tins of coffee, flour, and beans. It was a fortress of solitude. Levi entered behind them, carrying their crate and blankets. He dumped the blankets on the floor near the stove. "You and the children can sleep there," he said. It was not unkind, just a statement of fact. Annie Mae nodded, her eyes on the large, empty bed in the corner. "And you, Mr. Rollins?" "I have work in the barn," he said. He turned and walked back out, closing the door behind him. Annie Mae's breath came out in a shudder. She was safe. For tonight. She built a fire in the stove, her hands clumsy with the unfamiliar flue. The cabin slowly filled with warmth. She opened the crate and found the scraps of bread from the pantry. She gave the last of it to the children, then laid them down on the blankets and covered them. They were asleep in moments, exhausted by the fear and the journey. She sat on the floor, her back against the rough log wall, and watched the fire through the stove grate. She was warm. Her children were asleep. She should have been grateful, but she was terrified. She had traded a life she knew for one she did not. She had put her fate, and the fate of her children, into the hands of a stranger. A hard, silent man she remembered only vaguely from her childhood. As she sat there, the memories came, the whispers in the mercantile. "That's her, Jed Harper's wife," the way the other women would cross the street to avoid her. The day her own father had passed her, his eyes cold, and said, "The wages of sin are death. Daughter, you made your bed with a thief." Jedediah, he had been so handsome, with a quick smile and easy promises. He had promised her the world. Instead, he had given her shame. He had stolen the church roof fund, money saved for years, and gambled it away in a single night. When he knew he was caught, he had not even said goodbye. He had just ridden into the creek, and the town, in its righteous fury, had buried his sins on her back. She was the gambler's widow, the thief's wife, a stain. And now, she was a stain on Levi Rollins' floor. Outside, the stars were sharp as ice chips in the black sky. Levi did not go to the barn. He went to the small bunkhouse. A shed, really, where he kept his saddles and tools. He grabbed a spare blanket and his bedroll. He spread the bedroll on the porch, his back against the cabin wall. He could hear the faint crackle of the fire he had laid that morning. He pulled his hat over his eyes, but sleep did not come. He saw a different sky. 5 years ago, he saw a cottonwood tree by a dry creek bed. He saw his younger brother, Silas, standing on a wagon, a rope around his neck. Silas, who was quick to laugh and quicker to fight, but who was not a thief. Not a horse thief. Levi knew it in his bones. "I didn't do it, Levi," Silas had said, his voice hoarse, but his eyes clear. "You tell Pa, I didn't do it." Levi had been 2 days too late, caught in a blizzard up north. He had arrived just in time to watch the posse kick the wagon out from under his brother's feet. He had cut him down himself. He had buried him on his own land, under a pile of stones, because the town would not have him in their hallowed ground. He had never spoken of it again. The guilt was a cold, hard stone in his gut. He had not been there. He had not saved his brother. He shifted on the hard porch boards. He had brought this woman and her children here. He did not know why. Maybe it was because he saw in her the same thing he saw in Silas, someone the world had wrongly condemned, someone abandoned. Or maybe, he thought, as the cold Montana wind began to rise, it was just because he was tired of ghosts, and for one night, At least, he had brought 3 living, breathing souls into his silent, empty home. He closed his eyes, the image of a small, broken toy horse in his mind, and listened to the vast, indifferent land settle in for the night. Annie woke before the sun, jolted from a light, troubled sleep by the unfamiliar sounds of the cabin, the creak of cooling timbers, the rustle of a mouse in the walls. For a moment, her heart seized in old panic, her mind still in the damp, cold shack, bracing for a threat. Then she saw the dark, solid shape of the iron stove and the faint orange glow of the banked embers within. She was here, at Levi Rollins' ranch. Her children, Thomas and Sarah, were still fast asleep on the pallet, burrowed into the blankets, their face slack with a kind of deep rest she had not seen in months. The warmth in the cabin was a solid, physical thing, a luxury she had almost forgotten. She heard a noise from outside, a sharp cough, then the sound of a boot scraping on the porch boards. He was out there. He had slept on the porch, in the cold, while she and her children took his cabin. The thought sent a fresh wave of humiliation through her. She was a burden, a stray he had brought in, and now he was exiled from his own home. She had to earn her keep. She had to make herself useful, not just a mouth to feed. Pride was a thin coat against the wind, but it was the only one she had left. Quietly, so as not to wake the children, she slipped out of her blanket. She added a few small pieces of wood to the stove, her movements practiced and silent. She found the coffee tin and the pot. She did not know how he liked it, but she knew how to make it strong. She found the water bucket by the door, which he must have filled before he bedded down, and she set the coffee to boil. When the sky was a pale, bruised gray, the cabin door opened. Levi stood there, his duster damp with morning dew, his hat in his hand. He looked like he had not slept. His eyes were tired, and he needed a shave. He stopped on the threshold, surprised to see her up. The smell of fresh, hot coffee filled the room. He looked at the pot, then at her. Annie Mae kept her eyes down, fixed on her own hands, clasped at her waist. "Morning," he grunted. "Mr. Rollins," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. I made coffee." He nodded once, walked past her to the shelf, and took down a tin mug. He poured the steaming black liquid, wrapped his hands around the mug, and breathed in the steam. He did not say thank you, but he did not have to. The way he held the cup was enough. He drank it standing by the door, looking out at the gray land. Annie Mae felt rooted to the spot, an intruder in his morning ritual. She did not know what to do. "There is bacon in the cooler box outside," he said, still looking out, "and flour in the bin. The children will be hungry." He set the mug down and walked out, grabbing his saddle from the barn wall. He was going to work. He was leaving her in his home. Annie Mae let out a breath she did not know she was holding. She found the bacon, the flour, and a tin of lard. She washed her hands and face in a basin of icy water, then did the same for the children when they stirred. They looked around, their eyes big and confused in the new space. "Where are we, Mama?" Sarah asked, her voice small. "We are at Mr. Rollins's home, Sweetling," Annie Mae said, forcing a calmness into her voice she did not feel. "We are going to be here for a little while." "Is he a giant?" Thomas asked, looking at the high raftered ceiling. "No, hush now. Let us eat." She made bacon and rough biscuits, dividing them fairly. She saved a portion, covering it with a plate for Levi, and set it on the stove to keep warm. Then she began to work. She did not ask. She simply started. The cabin was a man's space, tidy in a rough way, but it lacked a woman's touch. She found a broom and swept the floor, not just the middle, but deep into the corners, clearing out the dust and tracked in mud. She took the tin plates and mugs from the shelf, scrubbed them with soap and hot water until they shone, and stacked them neatly. She found Levi's mending basket. It was full of socks with holes, a shirt with a torn cuff, another with a missing button. She sat by the window, the children playing quietly on the floor with 2 small pebbles they had found, and she began to sew. Her stitches were small and tight, a line of perfect, tiny anchors. It was work she knew. It was honest. With every pull of the needle, she felt a fraction of her dignity return. She was not begging. She was working for their supper. When Levi returned at midday, he stopped at the door again. The room was different. The air was cleaner. His mended socks were in a neat pile on his bed. The plate of biscuits and bacon sat waiting for him. He looked at the pile of socks, then at Annie Mae, who had her head bent over his torn shirt. She did not look up, pretending to be absorbed in her work. He walked to the stove, picked up a biscuit, and ate it in 2 bites. He drank water straight from the dipper. "Thank you for the mendin'," he said, his voice gruff. "It is the least I can do," she replied, still not meeting his eyes. He lingered, seeming to want to say something more, but the words would not come. He was a man of fences, horses, and open sky. This was different. He cleared his throat. "I am moving the cattle to the north pasture," he said. "I will be back by dark." He left. Annie Mae watched him go, a tall, solid figure moving with purpose toward the barn. The next few days settled into a quiet, unspoken rhythm. Annie Mae would rise, make coffee, and feed the children. She would clean, cook, and mend. She scrubbed the floors, washed the single window until the weak spring light streamed in, and even organized his shelves, stacking the tins into neat rows. She found a stash of old clothes in a trunk, shirts and trousers worn thin, and began cutting them into squares for a quilt, her fingers needing to stay busy. Levi, in turn, continued to sleep on the porch, though the nights were still bitingly cold. He never complained. He simply accepted it. One evening, he returned from town, his mule cart loaded. He brought in the usual sacks of flour and beans, but Annie Mae noticed him carry something else to the corner where her pallet lay. He unrolled 2 thick, new wool blankets and a small, soft pillow. He did not say anything. He just placed them on top of her thin ones and then went to the barn to tend his horses. Annie Mae touched the wool. It was thick and clean. Her eyes burned. It was kindness, plain and simple, and it felt almost as sharp as cruelty. It made her feel the debt more keenly. The children, however, had no such burdens. Their world was small and immediate. After the initial fear, the ranch became a place of wonder. Sarah, who was quiet and watchful like her mother, discovered the horses. She was terrified of Buck, Levi's buckskin, but she fell in love with the gentle pack mule, Jenny. One afternoon, Levi found her standing by the corral, very still, holding out a blade of new grass. The mule lipped it gently from her hand. A few days later, Levi came out of the barn to find her carefully, clumsily braiding a piece of straw into the mule's rough mane. She froze when she saw him, ready to run. Levi stopped. He watched her for a moment. "She likes that," he said, his voice low. "Likes her mane being combed." Sarah stared at him, then gave a small, shy smile. It was the first time Levi had seen either of them smile. Thomas was different. He was a boy, full of a restless energy that had been suppressed by hunger and fear. He was drawn to Levi like a moth to a flame. He would follow him to the barn, standing just outside the doorway, watching him curry Buck or oil a saddle. He never spoke, just watched, his hands clutching his broken wooden horse. One morning, Levi was repairing a broken harness strap. Thomas crept closer, his eyes on the sharp awl and the thick waxed thread. "What's that for?" Thomas finally whispered, pointing. Levi did not look up from his work. "Fixin' the leather. It's split." He pushed the needle through, his hands strong and sure. Thomas watched. "My horse is split." He held up the broken toy. Levi finished his stitch and tied it off. He looked at the toy. "It is," he agreed. He took a small tin from his workbench. It was hide glue. He put a dab on the splintered end of the toy's leg, pressed it into place, and then wrapped it tightly with a thin piece of waxed thread. "You let that sit till supper," Levi said, handing it back. "It'll hold." Thomas looked at the mended horse, his eyes wide with awe. He ran his thumb over the tight wrap. He looked up at Levi, his gaze full of a hero worship that made Levi profoundly uncomfortable. The boy nodded, clutching the horse, and ran back to the cabin. Annie Mae watched it all from the window. She saw her children, who had been silent and hollow-eyed, slowly coming back to life. She saw her daughter's smile and her son's repaired toy, and it terrified her. They were putting down roots. They were beginning to trust this man, and she knew, better than anyone, how quickly trust could be shattered. She worked harder, avoided him more. She kept her conversations to "Yes, Mr. Rollins," or "Supper is ready." She was still living in the shadow of the church pantry. Humiliated by the charity she could not refuse, she felt like a squatter, a trespasser on his kindness. One afternoon, Levi found her behind the cabin, staring at a patch of hard, rocky ground. The spring thaw was just beginning, and the soil was dark and damp, but choked with stones. "You are looking hard at that dirt," Levi said, coming up beside her. Annie Mae started, flustered. "I was just thinking, it is south-facing. It gets the sun." Levi nodded. He knew what she was thinking. He had seen her sorting through his stores, rationing the dried beans and cornmeal, making them stretch. "My PA always said a garden is a promise," he said quietly, mostly to himself. "It is a good patch," she said, her voice small, "if it were cleared." Levi looked at the ground, then at her. He saw the longing in her face. It was not just for food, but for purpose, for something to be hers. "It's your patch, if you want it," he said. Annie Mae's head snapped up. "What?" "I've got no use for it. I am no good with gardens. But that patch, it is good soil under the rock. You want to plant, you plant." She was stunned. He was not offering her scraps from his table. He was offering her his land, a piece of his homestead. I have no seeds." "Miller's Mercantile has seeds. I am riding in tomorrow." "I cannot ask you to." "You are not asking," Levi interrupted, his voice firm. "I am offering. You'll be doing me the favor. A man gets tired of his own cooking. Some fresh corn and beans would be good." He was giving her a way to see it as a trade, not a gift. He was sparing her pride. The generosity of it, the simple understanding, made her throat tighten. She could only nod. "Thank you, Mr. Rollins." The next day, he returned with seed packets, corn, beans, squash, and potatoes. He also brought a new, sturdy hoe and a digging fork. He left them by the cabin door. The work was brutal. The ground was hard as iron, locked in the last of the frost. Annie Mae worked until her hands were raw. She dug out rocks, her back screaming in protest. Thomas and Sarah helped, carrying the smaller stones in their skirts, making piles. It was a fight for every inch of soil. Levi watched her from the barn. He saw her struggle, her thin frame straining against the earth. But he did not help. This was hers. He knew, instinctively, that she needed to claim this ground for herself. She finally turned the soil, raked it smooth, and with her children, she planted the seeds. She built a small, crude fence of sticks and twine to keep the rabbits out. When she was done, she stood back, her hands blistered and bleeding, her dress stained with mud, and she looked at the neat rows of dark earth. It was the first thing she had owned since Jedediah had gambled away their last dollar. Spring in Montana was a fickle thing. One day it was warm, the sun a promise. The next, the sky turned a mean, metallic gray, and the wind came howling down from the mountains. Annie Mae had just finished hanging a load of laundry on the line Levi had strung between the cabin and a tall pine. It was the first time she had been able to wash their clothes properly. As she pinned the last of Thomas's shirts, the air went still. It was a heavy, ominous silence. Then the wind hit. It came not as a breeze, but as a solid wall, tearing the pins from her grasp. "Annie!" Levi roared from the barn. He was running toward her. "Get the children inside!" The wind ripped the wet shirt from her hand and sent it flying across the yard. The clothesline bucked and snapped like a whip. "My clothes!" she cried. The thought of losing them, of Levi's mended shirt and her children's only spare garments being lost to the storm, was devastating. "Leave them! Get inside!" But she did not. She lunged for a small dress of Sarah's as it cartwheeled past. The wind tore at her hair, whipping it across her face, stinging her eyes. Levi swore, grabbing her arm, "It is not worth it." Just then, the pine tree groaned. The heavy poles supporting the clothesline ripped from the ground, the entire line, heavy with wet clothes, collapsing into the mud and dirt. "No!" Annie cried out, a sound of pure despair. The sky opened. It was not rain, but stinging, hard-blown sleet. "We have to get them!" she yelled over the roar of the wind, pulling against his grip. "It is all we have." He saw the desperation in her eyes. It was not just clothes. It was her work. It was her dignity. "All right," he yelled, his face hard against the ice. "Together!" They plunged into the muddy mess. They fought the wind, gathering the soiled, sodden garments. Levi's greater strength was the only thing that kept the larger blankets from being ripped from their grasp. They were soaked to the bone in seconds, the sleet plastering their clothes to their bodies. They worked in a frantic, wordless rhythm, grabbing, folding, and shoving the ruined laundry into a pile by the door. When the last piece was salvaged, Levi pushed her toward the cabin. "Get in! Get warm!" They stumbled inside, gasping, and slammed the door against the storm. They stood dripping on the floor, the pile of muddy laundry at their feet. The cabin was suddenly terribly quiet. They were alone. The children were huddled on the bed, wide-eyed. Annie Mae looked at the muddy pile. All that work, ruined. She sank onto a chair, the fight gone, and put her face in her hands. She did not weep, but a dry, shuddering sob escaped her. Levi stood there, water dripping from his hat. He had seen men break on the trail. He had seen them curse, seen them fight. He had never seen this kind of quiet, deep-boned weariness. He went to the stove and shoved wood into it until it roared. He grabbed a blanket from his own bed. "Get those wet things off," he ordered. His voice was not harsh, but it was not soft either. It was an order. "You'll catch your death." He turned his back to her, giving her privacy. He stripped off his own wet duster and shirt, standing in his long johns, rubbing his hair dry with a rough towel. Annie Mae's hands were numb, shaking. She could not unfasten the tiny buttons on her bodice. She fumbled, her fingers useless. "I cannot," she whispered, her voice trembling. Levi turned. He saw her struggling. He hesitated for only a second. He walked over, gently pushed her hands aside, and, with his large, calloused fingers, he undid the buttons. He was clumsy but quick. He did not look at her skin. He kept his eyes on the buttons. He pulled the wet dress off her shoulders, took the blanket, and wrapped it tightly around her, covering her completely. "Sit by the fire," he said. He hung their wet clothes on a line he strung inside, near the stove, where they dripped onto the hearth. He handed her a dry pair of his own wool socks. He was splitting more wood by the fire, the storm raging outside. When it happened, the axe blade was wet. His hands were cold. It glanced off the log, a fraction of an inch, and sliced across the palm of his left hand. He did not make a sound, but he dropped the axe. Blood welled up, dark and fast, dripping onto the floor. "Mr. Rollins!" Annie Mae cried, dropping the socks. "It is nothing," he said, grabbing a dirty rag from his pocket and pressing it against the cut. "That is not nothing," she said. The shame was gone, replaced by a different, sharper instinct. "Sit, let me see." "It is fine, ma'am." "Sit down, Levi." She had never used his first name. The word hung in the air between them. He looked at her, surprised by her tone. He sat at the table. She unwrapped the rag. The cut was deep, running from his thumb across the fleshy part of his palm. It was bleeding badly. "It needs a stitch," she said, her voice tight. "I do not have a needle for it." "Then it must be bound tightly." She went to her mending basket, but not for a needle. She pulled out a clean strip of cotton and a small, dark tin. "What is that?" he asked. "Yarrow salve," she said. "My grandmother taught me. It stops the bleeding and keeps the rot out." She opened the tin. The salve was dark green and smelled of pine and herbs. Her hands, which had been trembling, were now perfectly steady. She gently, firmly, smeared the salve into the wound. Levi hissed as it stung, but he did not pull away. Her touch was soft, but sure, clinical. She then wrapped the cotton strip around his hand, pulling it tight. Her small hands moved with an efficiency that surprised him. She tied it off. The bleeding had already slowed. "You'll need to keep it clean," she said, her voice back to its quiet self. She was suddenly aware of how close they were, of the smell of wet wool and the pine from the salve. She was wrapped in his blanket. He was half-dressed. She pulled back, clutching the blanket tighter. Levi looked at his bandaged hand. It throbbed, but the bandage was neat. "You have a surgeon's touch." "I have had practice," she said quietly. "Jedediah, he was not a careful man, and the children, they fall." The name of her dead husband hung in the air. Levi looked at her. He saw the fatigue in her face, the smudge of dirt on her cheek from the storm. He saw the woman who had fought the wind for a child's dress and who had doctored his hand without flinching. He got up and ladled 2 bowls of the stew she had made earlier. He put them on the table. "Eat," he said. "The children are sleeping through it." They sat at the small table, the storm howling outside, the cabin lit only by the firelight. They ate in silence for a few minutes. It was not the comfortable silence of long companions, but it was not the strained, awkward silence of before, either. It was the silence of 2 people who had just been through a battle together. "You should not have done it," Levi said, breaking the quiet. Annie Mae looked up. "The clothes?" "Come in here. You should not have followed me." I could not ask you for more clothes," she whispered, looking down at her stew. "I cannot pay you for what you have already given." "This is not about pay," he said, and his voice was rough. "I did not bring you here for that." "Then why?" she asked, her voice rising, the fear and humiliation of the past weeks finally breaking through. "Why did you? Out of pity? To show the town of Two Forks how charitable you are, to have a servant? Why, Mr. Rollins? Because I lie awake every night wondering why I'm here, and what you expect from me." Levi put his spoon down. He looked at his bandaged hand. He looked at the fire. "I told you, it is not charity." He paused, searching for the right words. They did not come easily to him. I know what it is," he said. "To have this town look through you, to have them whisper, to be blamed for something that was not your doing." He was not looking at her. He was looking at the flames, but he was seeing something else. A cottonwood tree, a rope. "My brother, Silas," he said, the name tasting like rust in his mouth. "They hung him 5 years ago for horse theft." Annie Mae gasped. She remembered. It had been the talk of the town. The Rollins boy. "He did not do it," Levi said, his voice flat, dead. "He was wild, but he was not a thief. I was gone, on a drive. I got back too late. They were so proud of their quick justice." He clenched his good fist. "I buried him myself, on that hill yonder, because they would not let him in the churchyard. They called his name a stain. He finally turned and looked at her. His eyes were dark with a pain that matched her own. "When I saw you," he said, "in that pantry, with your children, all I could see was someone else the town was grinding under its heel. Someone else they were happy to call Stain. I did not bring you here for pity. I suppose I brought you here because I was tired of them winning." He stared at her. His confession laid bare. He was as scarred as she was, just in a different way. Annie Mae looked at this hard, silent man, and for the first time, she truly saw him. She saw the guilt he carried, the silent grief. He was not her savior. He was just as lonely as she was. "I am sorry for your brother," she said, her voice soft. He nodded, accepting her words. "You and the children," he said, his voice firm again. "You are safe here. This is not a debt. This is just a place to be. That is all." They finished their stew in silence. The storm began to die down, the wind's howl softening to a moan. Annie Mae rewashed the muddy clothes in the basin and hung them again, this time by the stove, where they steamed in the heat. She made up the children's pallet again, adding the new, thick blankets. She built up her own bedroll. Levi took his original blanket from the bed and his bedroll. "Mr. Rollins," she said, stopping him. "Levi," he corrected. "Levi, you should take your bed, your hand. You should not be on the cold porch." "I am fine," he said, stubborn. "It is not right," she insisted. I am not afraid. I will sleep by the stove. Please, take your bed." He looked at her, at the sincerity in her face. She was not offering out of fear, but out of genuine concern. He was tired. The cold from the storm had settled in his bones. He nodded. "All right, but you take the bedroll. It is softer than the floor." He laid his bedroll out on the floor for her, near the stove, closer to her children. He took his bed for the first time since she had arrived. The cabin settled. The only sounds were the breathing of the children and the dying whine of the wind. Annie Mae lay awake for a long time, wrapped in the bedroll. She was warm. She was safe. Her children were safe. She listened to the steady breathing of the man on the other side of the room. He was not a threat. He was not a saint. He was just a man, as broken as she was. Hours later, a log shifted in the stove, sending a spark. She sat up. In the dim glow from the fire grate, she could see Levi, asleep on his bed. He had kicked off the blanket, and his bandaged hand was resting on his chest. She stood up, walked quietly across the room, and gently pulled the blanket back up, covering his shoulders. He did not stir. She stood there for a moment, watching him sleep. The hard lines of his face were softer. He looked younger and more vulnerable. He had shared his grief. He had given her a name for his kindness. It was not pity. It was recognition. Something in her chest, a knot of fear and pride that had been clenched tight for over a year, finally, just a little, began to soften. She went back to her bedroll, and for the first time in his house, she fell into a deep and dreamless sleep. The hard, biting spring melted into a summer of surprising gentleness. The wind, which had been a constant tormentor, softened into a warm breeze that carried the scent of sweet clover and pine. The endless gray sky turned a deep, clear blue, and the land, which had seemed so brutal, unfurled. The rolling hills turned a vibrant green, dotted with yellow sunflowers and purple lupine. For the first time, the land did not feel like an enemy. Life on the ranch settled. The sharp edges of their awkwardness began to wear smooth, eroded by the simple, shared rhythm of daily work. The cabin, once a silent fortress of a lonely man, began to change. The first sound to return was laughter. Annie Mae, her face shaded by a worn straw hat Levi had left in the barn, was on her knees in her garden. The patch of earth she had fought for was now a thriving square of green. The corn was knee-high, and the bean vines were starting to climb the crude poles she had made. She was weeding, her hands, no longer blistered, moving quickly through the soil. Sarah, who had grown braver, was trying to feed a grasshopper to one of the 3 chickens Levi had bought. The hen, suspicious, kept dodging. Sarah, in a fit of giggles, tossed the grasshopper, and the hen snatched it. The little girl's laugh was thin and bright, like a tiny silver bell. Annie Mae froze, her hand deep in the dirt. She had not heard her daughter laugh like that, a true, careless laugh, in over a year. She looked over at the barn, where Levi was teaching Thomas to groom the mule. The boy was chattering, a constant stream of questions that Levi answered in his usual short, gruff sentences, but he was answering them. It was no longer Levi's cabin and her pallet. It was a shared space. The chores were not spoken of, they were simply done. He mended the corral fence, and she mended his shirt. She made the bread, and he stacked the firewood. He hunted a deer, and she smoked and salted the meat, filling the pantry shelves. After his hand had healed, the bandage gone, Levi had moved back to the porch. The first night he did, Annie Mae had felt a strange, sharp pang of, not fear, but coldness. The cabin felt empty again, but she understood. He was a man of strict propriety. It was his way of protecting what little was left of her reputation. But the cabin itself was no longer just his. One day, Annie Mae took the trunk of old, worn-out shirts she had been saving. She cut them into strips and squares. For 2 weeks, in the evenings by the firelight, she sewed. Levi came in from the north pasture one afternoon, tired and covered in dust. He stopped at the door, just as he had that first day. The single, grime-streaked window was now covered. She had sewn new curtains. They were a patchwork of faded blue calico and white shirting, but they were clean and bright. They softened the harsh light, making the room feel like a home. He looked at the curtains, then at Annie Mae, who was stirring a pot at the stove, her back to him, bracing for his reaction. They keep the afternoon sun out," she said, her voice small. "It will keep the room cooler." Levi stood there for a long time. He took off his hat and wiped the sweat from his brow. "Aye," he said, his voice quiet. "That they will. It is good." He hung his hat on its peg and went to the wash basin. Annie Mae let out a breath she did not know she was holding. He, too, was changing. He was gentler with the children. His connection with Thomas, built on a mended toy horse, had solidified. The boy was his shadow. "A man needs to know how to ride," Levi declared one morning, "not just sit on a mule." He led his own horse, Buck, into the corral. The buckskin was a big, powerful animal, and Thomas looked at it with terror and awe. "He's too big," Thomas whispered. "He is," Levi agreed. "And he knows it. That is why you have to show him you are bigger, not in size, in your mind." Annie Mae watched from the porch, her hands wrapped in her apron. Levi's scarred, calloused hands, which she had tended, were now lifting her son, placing him on the wide saddle. He did not just put him up and let him go. He stood by the horse's head, one hand on the bridle, the other resting near Thomas's leg, walking him in a slow, tight circle. "Keep your heels down," Levi instructed. "Look where you are going, not at the ground. The horse knows where the ground is." Thomas was stiff with fear, but after a few minutes, a shaky smile broke out on his face. He was high above the world. He was riding. Annie Mae watched the tall, silent man and the small, fatherless boy, and a feeling so warm and sharp bloomed in her chest that it frightened her. It was gratitude, but it was tangled up with something else, something more dangerous, a feeling of belonging, and belonging was a trap. The real world could not be held at bay by patchwork curtains and riding lessons. They were running low on salt, flour, and coffee. The garden was thriving, but it was not enough. The trip to Two Forks could not be postponed any longer. The morning they were to go. A heavy silence fell over the cabin. Annie Mae dressed the children in their best, mended clothes. She put on her own faded calico, the one she'd been wearing in the church pantry. It was clean now, and pressed, but it was still the dress of a beggar. Levi hitched the mule to the larger wagon, not the small cart. It felt formal, a statement. Annie Mae and the children sat on the bench. Levi sat beside her. It was the first time they had ridden side by side. As they neared the town, Annie Mae's hands began to tremble. She clasped them in her lap, her back straight as a fence post. Two Forks had not forgotten. As the wagon rolled down the main street, conversations stopped. Men on the boardwalk stopped whittling. Women, baskets on their arms, stared. They did not stare with open curiosity. They stared with a cold, flat, silent judgment. The air grew thick with it. Annie Mae kept her eyes fixed forward, on the mule's ears. She could feel the stares like small, hot needles on her skin. She saw Mrs. Miller, the mercantile owner's wife, cross the street, pulling her own daughter aside as if Annie Mae were a carrier of plague. Levi's jaw was set, a hard line of muscle working. He kept the mule at a steady walk, his gaze as level and unbothered as if he were riding his own pasture. He would not give them the satisfaction of seeing him hurry. He pulled the wagon up in front of Miller's mercantile. "You and the children wait here," he said, his voice low. "I can help," Annie Mae offered, her voice barely audible. "No, stay in the wagon." It was an order, but she knew it was for her protection. He went inside. Annie Mae sat in the terrible, public silence. Sarah hid her face in Annie Mae's skirt. Thomas, trying to be brave, stared at the men on the boardwalk with a defiant look that only made him look more vulnerable. A man stumbled out of the saloon, wiping his mouth on his sleeve. He was a thick-set man named Sloan, a man who had often drunk with Jedediah Harper. He saw Annie Mae. He stopped, a slow, malicious grin spreading across his face. He sauntered over to the wagon, close enough that Annie Mae could smell the sour whiskey on his breath. "Well, well," he slurred, looking her up and down. "If it ain't the preacher's girl, Jed Harper's, leavin's." Annie Mae flinched, pulling Sarah closer. "Please, sir, we do not want any trouble." "Oh, no trouble?" Sloan sneered, his eyes dropping to her patched bodice. "Just admirin'. Heard you'd fallen on hard times. Looks like you found a new situation." He laughed, a wet, ugly sound. "Tell me, Mrs. Harper, is Rollins paying you better than Jed did?" Annie Mae's face went white. She felt faint with humiliation. Just then, Levi came out of the mercantile, a 100-pound sack of flour on his shoulder. He saw Sloan, saw the look on his face, and the look of frozen terror on Annie Mae's. He did not hesitate. He dropped the sack of flour. It hit the boardwalk with a heavy, explosive thud. Sloan turned, startled. "Now, Rollins, I was just passing the time." Levi crossed the distance in 2 strides. He was not the quiet, gentle man from the ranch. This was a different person. His eyes were flat, dead. It was the face of a man who had seen his brother hang. He grabbed Sloan by the front of his shirt, twisting the fabric, and slammed him back against the wooden awning post. Sloan's head hit the wood with a crack. "Levi!" Annie Mae screamed. It was a sharp, terrified cry. Levi did not seem to hear. He drew back his right fist, his knuckles white. He was going to kill him. "No, please!" Annie Mae scrambled from the wagon, running to him, grabbing his arm. "Levi, do not! Please! He is not worth it! Look at the children! Please!" Her words, her terror, finally broke through. Levi looked at her, his chest heaving. He saw her desperate, pleading face. He saw Thomas standing up in the wagon, his small fists clenched, his face pale with fear. The killing rage receded, replaced by a cold, precise fury. He did not hit Sloan. He shoved him, hard, up against the post. He brought his face close, You say one word, Levi whispered, his voice a low, deadly growl. You ever look at her again, you ever speak her name, I will find you, and I will finish this. He let go. Sloane, his eyes wide with fear, slid down the post and scrambled away, disappearing back into the saloon. Levi stood there, breathing hard. He turned. The street was silent. Every person, Mr. Miller on his doorstep, the blacksmith, the women, everyone was watching. Their faces were not shocked. They were vindicated. They were watching the quiet, outcast Levi Rollins brawl in the street over a fallen woman. Annie Mae had proven them right. She was trouble. She was a stain. Levi's face was hard. He walked back to the flour sack, lifted it as if it were a feather, and slung it into the wagon bed. He loaded the rest of the supplies in a furious, controlled silence. Annie Mae climbed back onto the wagon bench, her entire body trembling. She could not look at him. She could not look at anyone. Her eyes burned, but she would not cry. Not here, not in front of them. Levi climbed up beside her. He slapped the reins, and the wagon lurched forward. They rode out of two forks, the 50 pairs of eyes following them until they were out of sight. The 2-hour ride back to the ranch was the longest of their lives. The silence was thick and cold, a heavy blanket of shame and anger. Levi stared straight ahead, his jaw tight. Annie Mae sat rigid, seeing nothing, her humiliation of physical sickness in her stomach. When they reached the homestead, Levi did not speak. He got down, unhitched the mule, and began unloading the supplies. Annie Mae took the children inside. "Go to your pallet," she told them, her voice flat. "Play." She turned and went back outside. Levi was stacking the sacks in the pantry shed. She stood by the door, twisting her apron in her hands. "You should not have done that," she said. Her voice was shaking. Levi did not turn around. He needed to be taught. "Taught? Or do you mean you needed to prove something?" she cried, the words tumbling out. "Do you see what you did? You proved them right. Everything they whisper, you proved it. They will say I have corrupted you, that I am what he called me. That word, a harlot." "I do not care what they say," Levi bit out, slamming a bag of beans onto the shelf. "But I care," she shouted, and the sound of her own raised voice shocked them both. "I care. That was your name you just threw in the mud. Your good name, your ranch. They will talk. They will. They will come here. They will try to run us off. I will not be the reason you lose this. I will not." She was backing away, her eyes wide with a new terror. She had brought this on him. She had ruined him, just as she had ruined everything else. "Annie," he said, finally turning to face her. He took a step toward her. "No," she whispered. "I cannot. I have to take the children. We will leave. Tonight I can—" "Stop!" He grabbed her arm, not gently. "You are not leaving. You have to let me go," she pleaded, tears finally breaking free, streaming down her face. "It is the only way. I am a stain, Levi, just like your brother, and I am staining you." His face changed. The anger vanished, replaced by a raw frustration. "My reputation," he said, his voice dropping. "That reputation is worthless. I told you, it is worthless. I do not care what those hypocrites think. I do not care what they whisper." He let go of her arm, but he did not move away. He was too close. She could feel the heat from him. "I care," he said, his voice rough with an emotion she could not name. "I care that he hurt you. I care that he made you look like that. That is all I care about." "It does not matter," she whispered, looking at the ground. "It is what they think, and you live here." "This is my land," he said, his voice a low growl. "Not theirs. This is my land, and I will not be run off it by them, and neither will you." He was too close. His anger, his defense of her, it was too much. It was a kindness she could not bear. She tore away from him and fled. She ran to her garden, her sanctuary. She fell to her knees and began to weed, pulling at the plants with a frantic, desperate energy, her tears falling onto the dark soil. Levi watched her go. He kicked the wagon wheel, a single, violent motion. He had tried to protect her, and he had only made it worse. He had made her feel trapped. He had made her feel owned. He turned and strode toward the back pasture, needing space, needing to hit something. He did not come back for supper. Annie Mae fed the children in silence and put them to bed. The sun set, and a high, thin moon rose, bathing the ranch in silver light. The cabin was silent, but it was the old, cold silence again. She saw him. He was out by the far fence line, the one that bordered the hill where his brother was buried. He was not just standing there. He was working. In the moonlight, she could see him digging, setting a new fence post. He was working off the rage. She waited. An hour passed. He did not stop. He was working like a man possessed, the thud of the post driver echoing faintly in the night air. Something was wrong. It was more than just the fight. She pulled her thin shawl around her shoulders and walked out into the cool night. The grass was wet with dew. As she got closer, the sounds of his work stopped. She found him. He was not working. He was leaning against the new post he had just set, his head buried in his arms. His shoulders were shaking. He was not a man who cried. He was the man who stood against the wind, who faced down bullies, who carried his grief like a stone, but the stone had finally broken. The fight in town, her words, his shame, and the nearness of his brother's grave, it had all undone him. He was making a low, terrible sound, a dry, racking sob of a man who had held his grief in silence for 5 years. "I am sorry, Silas," she heard him whisper into the wood. "I am sorry, I was not there." Annie Mae's heart broke. This was the wound he carried. This was the source of his lonely, silent strength. She did not retreat. She walked up to him quietly, her bare feet silent on the grass. He did not hear her. She came up beside him and, without a word, put her hand on his back. He flinched, a violent, startled movement, spinning around, ashamed to be seen. His face, in the stark moonlight, was a ruin of grief. "Levi," she whispered. It was not a question. It was just his name. He stared at her, his breath catching. He looked like a cornered animal, raw and exposed. He tried to turn away, to hide his face, but she moved with him. "It is all right," she said, her voice soft. "It is all right." She did not know what else to say. She put her other hand on his arm. He was trembling. He, who was as solid as the mountains, was trembling. He did not pull away. He looked at her face, which was not full of pity, but of a deep, quiet understanding. She knew what it was to be broken. He was innocent," Levi choked out, the words ripped from him. "And I was not here." "I know," she said, "I know." And she held him. She put her arms around his waist, pressing her face against his rough shirt, and just held him as the silent sobs shook his large frame. He was stiff at first, unused to comfort, unused to touch. Then, slowly, his arms came up. He did not embrace her, but his hands rested on her back, his fingers gripping her shawl. He leaned his weight against her, just for a moment, and let the grief wash over him. They stood like that for a long time, under the moon, by the fence line, two broken people, holding each other up. Finally, the shaking subsided. He pulled back, his breathing still ragged. He looked down at her, his hands still on her back. "Annie," he whispered. His voice was wrecked. He looked at her mouth, then at her eyes. The air between them changed. The night, the grief, the shared shame, the desperate loneliness. It all coalesced into something new, something sharp and undeniable. He lifted one hand, his calloused thumb brushing a tear from her cheek. His touch was hesitant, a question. She did not pull away. She did not flinch. She leaned into his hand, closing her eyes for just a second. It was an answer. He bent his head and kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was hungry. It was desperate. It was 5 years of his solitude and a year of her fear crashing together. It was the salt of her tears and the taste of his grief. It was a raw, vulnerable, wordless collision. He kissed her like a starving man, his hand moving from her cheek to the back of her neck, pulling her closer. Annie Mae's mind screamed in panic. Do not need him. Do not be weak. But her body betrayed her. She kissed him back. Her hands, which had been comforting him, clutched his shirt. She was so tired of being strong. She was so tired of being alone. The kiss deepened, becoming something else, something hotter, something that demanded more. It was too much. It was too fast. They both felt it at the same time. They broke apart, gasping as if coming up for air. They stared at each other, terrified by what they had just done. The silence that fell was more charged than the kiss itself. Without a word, Levi bent, picked up his tools, and started walking back to the cabin. Annie Mae followed a few steps behind him, her entire body shaking, her lips burning. They reached the cabin. The children were asleep. The fire was low. Annie Mae went to her pallet by the stove, her back to him. She lay down, pulling the blanket up to her chin, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was torn. She had felt something she thought was dead, desire, a deep, aching need to be held, but the fear was just as strong. Jedediah had used her needs against her. To need someone was to give them a weapon. She lay awake, rigid, fighting a war inside herself. Levi stood at the open door, the moonlight spilling onto the floor. He looked at her, a dark shape under the blankets. He looked at his own empty bed. He could not go back to the porch, not tonight. He could not leave her alone, and he could not be alone, but he could not get into his bed. That would be an assumption. It would be a threat. It would be what Sloane had accused him of. He closed the door, shutting out the rest of the world. He went to the trunk and pulled out his own spare bedroll. He did not go to his bed. He did not go near her. He spread the bedroll on the floor. Near the door, a guardian's post. It was the first time since his hand had healed that he had chosen to sleep inside. He lay down on the hard floor, a silent protector, an apology, and a promise, all in one. Annie Mae heard the rustle of the blankets. She turned, just her head. She saw his long shape on the floor between her and the door. He was not touching her. He was not demanding anything. He was just there. She closed her eyes, and a single, hot tear slipped from the corner of her eye and dampened the straw pillow. The wall she had been trying to build, it was gone, and she did not know if she was terrified or saved. The unspoken kiss lay between them like a loaded rifle. The morning after, Annie woke to find Levi's bedroll by the door already empty. He was outside, and the sound of his axe splitting wood was a sharp, angry punctuation in the dawn quiet. When he came in for coffee, he avoided her gaze, but he did not just stand by the door. He took his mug and sat at the table. Annie sat opposite, her hands wrapped around her own cup, the silence stretching. He did not move back to the porch. His bedroll on the floor became a permanent fixture, a silent, nightly declaration. He was guarding the door. He was guarding her. The tension of that kiss, of that shared grief, did not break. It settled, weaving itself into the fabric of their new life. They worked. It was the only thing they knew how to do. The garden, under Annie's constant care, thrived. The hard-won patch of earth was now lush, the pale green heads of cabbage forming, the corn tassels turning gold. Inside the cabin, things changed. One evening, Levi watched as Annie took the patchwork quilt she had been piecing together for weeks. a mosaic of his old blue shirts and her own faded calico. She did not put it on her bedroll. She folded it, stood on a chair, and hung it on the wall above the cold hearth. It was a shock of color, a bold, defiant claim on the grim, masculine space. It was an act of homemaking. The children, oblivious to the simmering tension between the adults, were the ones who truly healed the space. Their small voices, once silent, now filled the air. Sarah would sing to the mule, a tuneless, rambling song. Thomas, who now rode the mule with a proud straightness, would chatter to Levi about everything, a hawk he saw, a strange bug, the way the clouds looked. And Levi, the silent man, would listen. He would grunt or nod, or offer a rare, "Aye, it is." The cabin, once a fortress, began to sound like a home. There was the sizzle of bacon in the pan, the snap of the fire, the murmur of a child's song, and the constant, unspoken awareness between the two adults. They moved around each other like dancers in a small room, never touching, but always aware of the other's space. The outside world, however, was not content to leave them in their fragile peace. It was a Sunday. Levi was reinforcing a corral post when he saw the rider. It was not a cowboy. The man wore a black coat and a flat-brimmed hat, and he sat on his horse with a stiff, righteous posture. Annie saw him from the cabin window. Her hand flew to her throat. "Levi," she whispered, her voice tight with a familiar dread. Levi laid his tools down and walked to the porch, wiping his hands on his trousers. He stood at the top of the steps as the rider pulled up. It was not her father. It was Preacher Gideon, the man who had taken her father's pulpit after he had retired in shame. Preacher Gideon was a young man, but his face was hard with zealous conviction. "Mr. Rollins," Gideon said, not dismounting. His eyes flickered past Levi, into the cabin, where he could see Annie's silhouette in the shadows. "Preacher," Levi said, his voice was flat. "I am here on behalf of the elders of Two Forks," Gideon began, his voice rising, taking on the tone of the pulpit. "It has been brought to our attention that you are housing this woman." "I am," Levi said. "Mr. Rollins, you are a man who has held himself apart, but we have always considered you a God-fearing man. To take this woman, this widow of a thief, into your home, to live with her in sin, it is an affront to the community." Annie had stepped out onto the porch. She stood behind Levi, small and trembling, but she would not hide. Gideon's eyes fixed on her. "Mrs. Harper, you were raised in the light. You know the scripture. You are a stain on this land. You dishonored your father, and now you seek to drag this man down with you. The town will not abide it. You are a blight, madam, a stain." Levi had been still, utterly, unnervingly still. But at the word stain, the same word he had used to describe his own brother's fate, something in him went cold. He stepped off the porch. He walked slowly, deliberately, to the preacher's horse. He did not yell. He did not threaten. He looked up, and his eyes were as flat and gray as winter stone. "Preacher," Levi said, his voice quiet, but carrying in the still air, "you are on my land. You will not use that word here. You will not speak to her again." "I am speaking God's truth," Gideon declared, pulling back slightly from the intensity of Levi's gaze. "She is an adulteress, living in shame. She is a widow, living in my home, under my protection." Levi said, "You have two choices. You can turn that horse and ride away, or I can pull you off it and break you in half. Either way, you are leaving." The preacher's righteous fury sputtered in the face of such cold, simple menace. He looked at Levi's eyes and saw no mercy. He saw the man who had brawled in the street. "You will answer for this, Rollins." Gideon spat, pulling his horse's head around. "God will not be mocked." "Then you had best tell him to come himself," Levi said. Because you are not welcome here." The preacher kicked his horse and galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust and judgment. Levi stood, his back to Annie, watching until the rider was a small, black speck. Annie was leaning against the porch post, her face white. She had brought the wrath of the town, the wrath of God, to his door. "Levi," she whispered, her voice broken. "I am sorry, "Go inside, Annie," he said, not turning. "It is done." "But they will—" "Go inside." His voice was rough. He did not want to see her shame. He did not want to hear her apology. He was too full of a cold, white rage. He stalked off toward the barn. Annie retreated into the cabin. The patchwork quilt on the wall seemed to mock her. This was not her home. It was his, and she was poisoning it. The fragile peace was broken. For 3 days, a tense, cold quiet returned. Levi worked from sunup to sundown, his silence a wall she could not penetrate. She cooked, she cleaned, she tended the garden, but the fear had returned. She felt like a trespasser again, waiting for the final eviction. On the 4th day, the other rider came. This man was nothing like the preacher. He was short, but thick, with a greasy duster and a pistol tied low on his hip. He rode a mean-looking pinto, and he led a pack mule. He did not stop at the edge of the yard. He rode right up to the porch, as if he owned it. Annie was hanging laundry. Her heart stopped. She knew him. His name was Elias Thorne. He had been one of Jedediah's associates, a man who collected debts from backroom card games, a man who broke fingers for a living. Levi came out of the barn, his rifle held loosely in his hand, pointing at the ground. He had seen the man ride in. "That is close enough," Levi called out. Thorne grinned, showing a row of yellowed teeth. He stopped his horse. His eyes ignored Levi. They were fixed on Annie. "Well, Annie Mae, you are looking healthier. Country life agrees with you." "What do you want, Thorne?" Annie said, her voice shaking. But she stood her ground. "What I am owed," Thorne said, patting his horse's neck. "Your husband, Jed, he left in a hurry, left a lot of unfinished business. Owed me near $500, I figure, with interest. It is more, but I am a generous man." "My husband is dead." Annie said, "I have nothing." "Oh, I know he is dead," Thorne said, his voice turning oily. "And I know you have nothing, but a debt is a debt, and it has to be paid, one way or another." His eyes raked over her. A slow, appraising, insulting look. "A name follows you, Annie Mae, and so does what it owes." Levi stepped forward. The rifle came up, just a few inches. "She has nothing for you. You're on the wrong ranch. Ride out." Thorne finally looked at Levi. He sized him up. The rifle, the cold eyes, the hard land. "This your new man, Annie? He looks tougher than Jed, but Jed owed me, and a wife. A wife inherits." "She inherits nothing," Levi said. "Get off my land." "Or what, farmer?" Thorne sneered. "You'll shoot me? I'm just here for a friendly talk." "I am not a farmer," Levi said. "And this is not a talk. This is the last time I tell you. Leave." Thorne looked from Levi's steady hand on the rifle to Annie's terrified face. He smiled, that same yellow grin. He knew he could not win this. Not today, but he had planted the seed. "All right," he said, holding his hands up in mock surrender. "I will be back. A debt like that, it does not just go away. You think on how you are going to pay it, little widow." He turned his horse, spat a brown stream of tobacco juice into the dirt of her yard, and trotted away, whistling. The moment he was out of sight, Annie's strength evaporated. She sank onto the porch steps, her head in her hands. It was too much. The town, the preacher. Now this was not shame. This was violence. This was the dark, brutal world of her husband reaching out from the grave. Annie, Levi was beside her, his rifle leaning against the wall. You have to let me go, she said, her voice muffled by her hands. I cannot stay. He will be back. You do not know him. He is a violent man. He will hurt you. He will hurt the children. She stood up, her eyes wild with panic. I have to pack. We have to leave. I will go north. I will go anywhere. No, Levi blocked her way. You are not running. You do not understand, she cried, pushing against his chest. I am dragging you down. That man, he will not stop. He will come back with others. He will burn this place down to get what he wants. I will not be the reason. I will not. And where will you go? Levi demanded, gripping her arms. To another shack? To another pantry? To starve? You will not. It is better than this. It is better than waiting for him to hurt my children. And I will not let him. Levi roared. You cannot stop him, she screamed, hitting his chest with her fists. You cannot! He is not like the preacher. He is not like Sloan. He is like Jed. He is poison. Then we will cut the poison out, Levi said, his voice dropping, his grip on her arms tightening. You have to tell me everything. Annie stopped fighting. She went limp, the terror turning into a deep, shuddering despair. She looked up at him, her face a mask of old, deep-seated fear. You do not understand, she whispered. There is money. The money he stole. The church money. Levi went still. What? Jed, he did not gamble it all away. Not all of it. He came back to the shack, the night he ran. He was drunk, and he was laughing. She was shaking so hard she could barely speak. He hit me. Levi's face went dark. His grip on her arms gentled, but his eyes were murderous. He hit me, she repeated, the confession tearing out of her. And he told me he had a wedding present for me. He pulled up the floorboard. He had a box. He said, There it is, Annie Mae, your inheritance. He buried it under the floor. The church money, Levi whispered, understanding. And other things, papers, his debts. He said if I ever touched it, if I ever told anyone, he would find me. He said even if he was dead, his friends, like Thorne, they would find me, and they would make me pay for stealing from them. She was crying now, the dry, hard sobs of someone who had been terrified for too long. I was so scared, even after he drowned. I was too scared. I let my children starve. I let them eat scraps, because I was too scared to go back. I was too scared to dig it up. Levi stared at her, the pieces clicking into place. Her starvation, her fear, her shame. It was all tied to this, a box buried in the dirt. He let go of her arms. He turned and strode to the barn. He came back with a shovel, a lantern, and his axe. What are you doing? She asked, her voice trembling. He said you are not running. You are not. He grabbed her shawl from the porch railing and wrapped it around her shoulders. We are finishing this. Tonight. Where are we going? We are going to dig up your inheritance. He left the children, sleeping soundly, and padlocked the cabin door from the outside. A crude but effective defense. He hitched the mule to the cart, his movements quick and precise. Get in. They rode in silence, the moon a sliver, the land dark and full of shadows. Annie sat rigid, staring into the blackness, her mind replaying every threat Jedediah had ever made. She was returning to the place of her deepest shame, her deepest fear. Levi stopped the mule. The shack stood ahead of them, a sagging, skeletal shape against the night sky. It looked even smaller, more pathetic than she remembered. Stay here, Levi said. No, Her voice was a dry whisper, but it was firm. I have to. He nodded. He lit the lantern, the yellow glow pushing back the oppressive dark. He handed it to her. He kicked the shack door. It fell off its broken hinges, crashing to the dirt floor. The single room was as they had left it. The cold, cracked stove, the pile of straw. It smelled of mildew and rats. "Where?" Levi asked. Annie's hand trembled, the lantern light shaking. She pointed to the corner, where their bedroll had been. "There, under the floor." The floor was just packed earth and a few loose, rotting boards. Levi tossed them aside. He jammed the shovel into the hard-packed dirt. The sound was terrible, a rhythmic shunk, scrape, shunk, scrape. Annie stood in the doorway, holding the light, watching him. He was digging up her past. He was digging up her monster. For 10 minutes, he dug. The hole grew. Annie's breath hitched with every shovelful. Thud! The shovel hit something hard, something metallic. "That is it," she whispered. Levi knelt, throwing the dirt out with his hands. He uncovered the top of a rusted iron lockbox. It was heavy. He heaved it out of the hole and dropped it on the floor. He looked at Annie. "Is this it?" She could only nod, tears streaming down her face. Levi did not ask for a key. He wedged the blade of his axe into the seam, put his foot on the box, and threw his weight onto the handle. The rusted lock groaned, snapped, and the lid flew open. Annie held the lantern closer. It was full. On top, there were bundles of papers, tied with string, IOUs, gambling debts, a list of names. She saw Thorne's name near the top. Beneath the papers was money, piles of it, coins, greenbacks, and, separate, a thick, leather-bound book. Annie recognized it. It was the church ledger, the one that had gone missing with the money, and tucked inside it were several folded, official-looking documents. Levi looked at the contents. He looked at Annie's face, pale and stricken in the lantern light. He stood up. He did not touch the money. He did not touch the ledger. He grabbed the bundles of loose papers, Jedediah's personal debts. He grabbed the list of names. "This," he said, holding them up. "This is what Thorne wants. This is what your husband held over you." He took the papers and walked out of the shack. He strode to the cart and put the lockbox, with the money and the church documents, under the seat. "Levi?" she asked, following him. "What?" "The rest," he said, "is just paper." They rode back to the ranch in the same taut silence. When they arrived, he unlocked the cabin. The children had not stirred. He went to the stove and stoked the fire, the embers glowing bright. He took the fistful of papers, the IOUs, the list, Thorne's name, and he held them out. "This is your fear," he said. "This is his hold on you." He dropped them into the fire. Annie watched as the papers curled, blackened, and turned to ash. The ink flared and vanished. Thorne's name, Jedediah's threats, they were gone. She stood there, watching the flames, and a sound escaped her. It was a sound she had not made in years. It was not a sob of grief or a cry of fear. It was a sound of release, a deep, agonizing, purging wail. She collapsed, her knees buckling, but Levi was there. He caught her. He did not say anything. He just sank to the floor with her, pulling her against his chest, and held her. He held her as a year of starvation, a lifetime of fear, and the shame of her silence finally broke. She cried into his shirt, her hands clutching his arms, her body shaking apart. He was her anchor. He did not soothe her. He did not shush her. He just held her, solid as the mountain, and let her break, knowing she would not be swept away. It lasted a long time. The fire died down. The cabin grew quiet again. Her sobs softened into exhausted, shuddering breaths. She was empty. The fear was gone. The shame was gone. There was nothing left but the quiet of the cabin and the solid, warm strength of the man holding her. She pulled back, just enough to look at him. His face, in the dim firelight, was etched with a profound tenderness. He wiped the tears from her cheeks with his rough thumbs. "It is gone," he whispered. "It is gone," she echoed. He did not let her go. His hand stayed on her face, the gulf that had separated them, the awkwardness, the fear, the memory of that first desperate kiss. It was gone, burned away with the papers. He looked at her, and she looked at him. There were no more walls. There were no more secrets. He bent his head, and this time, the kiss was not the desperate collision of two lonely people. It was gentle. It was a promise. It was slow and deep and sure. It was the kiss of a man who had seen all of her shame and her fear, and had not turned away. She kissed him back, her hands moving from his arms to his neck. This was not the weakness she had feared. It was a different kind of strength. It was trust. He lifted her. She was light in his arms. He carried her away from the cold hearth, away from his bedroll on the floor. He carried her to his bed. He laid her down, and for the first time a man looked at her with something other than hunger or violence. He looked at her with a raw, intense, healing reverence. And in the quiet of the small cabin, with the children sleeping and the ghosts of their pasts finally laid to rest, they came together. It was not the desperate act she had known. It was slow. It was intense. It was amending. It was two scarred, broken pieces finally, gently, fitting together and becoming whole. The morning light in the cabin was different. It was soft. After the storm of their confessions, after the fire and the healing, a quiet intimacy had settled between them. Levi no longer slept on the floor. The bedroll was gone, stored away. When Annie woke, she woke to the solid warmth of his back. When he woke, it was to the scent of her hair on the pillow. They moved around each other with a new, unspoken language. A brush of his hand on her arm as she reached for the coffee pot. The way she would look up from her mending and find him watching her. A look in his eyes that was so open, so full of a quiet reverence. It still made her blush. The cabin, once a place of tension and silence, was now filled with a low, comfortable hum. The children felt it. The fear had leached out of them. They played in the yard with a carelessness that made Annie's heart ache with a fierce, protective joy. This fragile, new-spun piece lasted 8 days. Word, carried by a furious preacher Gideon, had spread through 2 forks like a grass fire. It was not just that Levi Rollins had threatened a man of God. It was not just that he was living with the harlot widow. It was that they were doing so openly, defiantly. The town's righteousness, robbed of its target when Elias Thorne had ridden out empty-handed, now turned, unified, upon the ranch in the hills. The whispers turned to plans. The land, the worthless scrub patch where Annie's shack stood, became a symbol. They called it church land, a convenient lie that had grown into gospel truth. They said she had desecrated it with her sin, and that she had hidden her husband's stolen money there. They would reclaim it. They would purify it. It was a holy excuse for a lynching of the spirit. This time the visitor was not a preacher. He wore a tin star. Sheriff Brody was a tall, weary man who looked like he had not slept well in a week. He rode up, not with the aggression of Thorne or the righteousness of Gideon, but with the heavy-footed misery of a man doing a job he hated. Levi saw him coming and met him on the porch. Annie came out and stood beside him. Not behind him. Beside him. They were a wall of 2. "Levi, ma'am," Brody said, touching the brim of his hat. He kept his eyes on Levi. "I am not here for pleasure." "Never figured you were," Levi said. "The town is riled," Brody said, looking off toward the hills. "Gideon's been preaching fire about that plot of land. About her. Gideon can preach himself hoarse. It has got nothing to do with me." Levi said. "It has now," Brody said, his voice dropping. "They held a meeting at the church. The elders, they..." They are citing decency laws. Levi, they say you are living in open sin, that you are corrupting the morals of the county. What I do on my own land is my own business. Levi's voice was dangerously low. Not anymore. Brody finally met his gaze. His eyes were tired. They've given me an ultimatum, and I'm here to give it to you. The law is, well, it is on their side in this. You have to make a choice. A choice, Levi repeated, his hand moving to rest on the porch post, his knuckles white. You have to marry the woman. Annie flinched as if struck. Make her an honest woman in the eyes of God and the law. Brody continued, reciting the words he had been told to say. Or, you have to turn her out. Send her away. The silence that followed was absolute. Levi stared at the sheriff, his face unreadable, but a dark, cold fury was building in his eyes. And if I do neither? Levi asked, his voice a quiet growl. Then I have to come back, Brody said, his voice full of gravel. And I will have to remove her by force. Levi, do not make me do that. My hands are tied. Just marry her. Put a ring on her finger. End this. Levi's rage was a visible thing. It was not the hot rage of the brawl in town. It was a cold, killing rage. He was furious, not at the idea of marrying Annie, but at the ultimatum, at the town, the preacher, the law, all of them, trying to force his hand, trying to tell him what to do on his own land, with his own life. You will come on my land, Levi said, stepping off the porch, with a warrant to take a woman and her children, because the preacher says so. I will come, Brody said, his voice firm, because it is the law. I do not like it, but it is the law. You have till the end of the week. Do the right thing, Levi, for her. He tipped his hat again, turned his horse, and rode away, leaving the ultimatum hanging in the air like poison. Annie stood frozen. It was over. She had been right. She was a stain, and she had finally, irrevocably, ruined him. Levi turned, walked past her, and slammed his fist into the solid log wall of the cabin. The sound was a flat, violent crack. The children, playing in the yard, went silent. Levi, Annie whispered, her hands shaking. Get your things, he bit out, his back to her. Her blood ran cold. It was the same words he had said in the pantry, but this time they meant the opposite. He was turning her out. He was obeying the law. I will, she said, her voice dead. I will be gone by nightfall. He spun around, his face a mask of such raw frustration it stunned her. What are you talking about? You said, get my things. No, he roared. He stalked over to her, grabbing her arms, his eyes blazing. You are not leaving. Not ever. Do you hear me? But the sheriff, the law, Levi, I cannot let you. To hell with the sheriff, he said. To hell with the town. And to hell with the preacher. This is my land. He was shaking with the force of his own anger. He stopped, took a deep, shuddering breath, and let go of her arms. He looked at her pale, terrified face. The anger drained away, replaced by something desperate, something honest. He paced the porch, once, twice, running his hands through his hair. He stopped in front of her. Annie, he said, and his voice was rough, wrecked. I am not a man who has a way with words. You know that. I wanted to do this right, to wait, to give you time. He took her hand. His was calloused and hard. Hers was small and trembling. Marry me, he said. She stared at him, her heart hammering. What? Will you marry me? Because of them? She whispered, her eyes filling with tears. Because the sheriff? No. His grip tightened. He pulled her closer. His eyes locked on hers, forcing her to see the truth. No, Not because of him, not because of the law. I asked him to hell, and I meant it. I am asking because of this. He gestures with his free hand. At the cabin, at the garden, at the children huddled by the fence. I am asking because I am tired of sleeping on the floor. I am tired of waking up in the morning and wondering if you will still be here. Because this cabin was just a box. Annie, it was a cold, empty box. And now it is, well, it is not because of you. I'm asking because I want to, because I need you. It was the most he had ever said at one time. It was a confession that stripped him bare, more than his tears by the fence post. Annie looked at his face, this hard, honest, broken man. He meant it. He was not marrying her to save her. He was marrying her because he wanted to. And she knew, in that instant, that she had to say no. She pulled her hand away, and the look of hurt and confusion on his face nearly broke her.
Levi, I cannot. You do not want me?
He stammered, the words hollow.
No,
she cried, putting her hand on his chest.
No, I do, I love you.
The words were out. She had said them. His eyes widened.
I love you,
she said again, the words gaining strength. I love you more than I thought I could ever love anyone, and that is why I cannot marry you. He was lost. I do not understand. Levi, Jedediah, he made promises too. He loved me in his own way, and that love turned to poison. It became a cage. What we have, this is real. It is safe. She was crying now, the tears she had held back spilling over. But I am so afraid. What if we marry, and the town leaves us alone, and the winter comes, and you look at me one day, and you do not see me? What if you see the burden, the whore widow Sloane called me? What if this feeling, what if it does not last? Then we are just trapped by the law, by a promise. I cannot, Levi, I cannot marry you because I am afraid of the sheriff. I will not trade one cage for another. Before he could answer, a small voice cut through the tension. Mama. Thomas was standing at the corner of the porch. Sarah was just behind him, her thumb in her mouth. They had heard it all. Mama, what is Mary? Thomas asked, his face pale. Is he sending us away? Are we going back? Sarah started to cry, a low, terrified wailing. The children did not understand the threat from the town. They understood the threat from within. They had seen their mother with one man. Now, another man was talking about marrying. And in their world, that meant upheaval. It meant loss. Oh, sweetling, no, Annie cried, rushing to them, pulling them both into her arms. No one is sending you away. You are home. You are safe. I promise. She held them tight, her back to Levi. He watched the small, broken family, and his heart ached. He finally understood. Her fear was not of him. It was of fear itself. She had been ruled by it for so long. She would not, could not, make the most important decision of her life while still under its shadow. He had been furious at the sheriff for trapping him, but he had just done the same thing to her. He had used the town's threat, his own need, and pushed her. He waited until she had calmed the children, until she had sent them, still worried, to check on the chickens. She stood up, her face exhausted. Levi, I'm sorry, Do not be, he said, his voice quiet, all the anger gone. He walked over to her. He did not touch her. You are right, he said. She looked up, shocked. You are right. I was angry. I was using the town's anger to force you. And that is not right. It is not what I meant. He took a step back, giving her space. So, here is the truth, he said, his voice steady, and she heard the absolute conviction in it. I will not let them take you, married or not. I will not let Brody or Gideon or anyone step foot on this land. I will fight them. I will stand on this porch with my rifle, and they will not take you. That is my promise." He looked at her, his gaze unwavering.
"So you are free. You do not have to marry me to be safe. You are safe right now because I am here."
"So you choose," he said. "You choose freely. Not because of them, not because of me. You choose if you want this. If you want me, I will not ask again, but I will be here. I will be right here." He turned, picked up his hat, and walked out toward the north pasture. He left her alone with her choice. Annie stood on the porch, the silence of the ranch settling around her. He had done it again. He had taken her fear, understood it, and disarmed it. He had taken the gun from her head. He had given her back her freedom. She was safe, married or not. The only question left was, what did she want? She did not want to be a burden. She did not want to be a kept woman. She wanted to be a partner. She spent the day in a daze. She fed the children. She weeded the garden, her hands moving, but her mind far away. She thought of the cold pantry. She thought of his hand, bandaged. She thought of him holding her as she cried. She thought of his voice saying, "I need you." That night, she fed the children and put them to bed. Levi came in, his face weary. They ate supper in their old, quiet way, but the silence was different. It was not tense. It was waiting. After, Levi sat at the table, cleaning his rifle. He did not look at her. He was giving her the space he promised. Annie watched him for a long time. She saw his strength. She saw his patience. She saw the man who had seen her at her absolute worst, covered in shame and pig scraps, and had not looked away. Her choice was so clear. It was a quiet, sharp pain in her chest. She stood up. She went to the large wooden trunk that held her few things. At the bottom, wrapped in paper, was a bolt of pale blue calico. She had bought it in a different life, before Jedediah, dreaming of a dress for a Sunday social. She had saved it, a last scrap of the girl she had been. She took it out. She also took her mending basket. She sat in the rocking chair Levi had built, a surprise he had left on the porch one evening, and in the low, flickering light of the fire, she began to sew. Levi stopped his work. He watched her. She did not look up. He saw her lay out the fabric, cutting it with a sure hand. He saw the needle flash in the firelight. She was not mending. She was making. He did not speak. He cleaned his rifle, his movements slow, his eyes rarely leaving her. He saw the determination in the set of her jaw, the simple, focused grace of her hands. He went to bed. He lay awake, listening to the snip of the scissors and the hiss of the thread pulling through the fabric. He fell asleep, and when he woke in the gray light before dawn, she was still there. The chair was empty. A new dress, simple, unadorned, with a square collar and long sleeves, was draped over the back of the chair. He got up. The cabin was empty. He felt a moment of raw panic. Had she left? He pulled on his boots and went outside. The air was cool and damp. The sun was just a faint pink line in the east. And she was there. She was standing in her garden. She was not looking at him. She was looking at the land, at the corn, now chest high. She was wearing the dress, and her feet were bare, planted firmly in the dark, rich soil she had turned with her own hands. He stopped, his heart in his throat. She turned. The pale blue dress was the color of the morning sky. Her hair was down, copper in the new light. Her face was calm. All the fear, all the hesitation, was gone. He walked toward her, and she did not move. He stopped a foot in front of her. He did not have to ask. "I choose this," Annie Mae said, her voice clear and strong in the morning air. "I choose you, Levi, freely, not from fear, from love." He reached out and touched her face.
his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "Annie," was all he could say, his voice thick. "I am ready," she said. He nodded, a slow, solemn understanding. "We do not need the preacher." "No," she said, "he is not welcome here." He took her hand. They walked, not to the cabin, but to the tall pine tree that stood guard over the ranch. They woke the children. They did not understand, but they saw their mother's face, and they were not afraid. They stood, the four of them, under the vast, open Montana sky. There was no one else, just them. I have no ring," Levi said, his voice rough. "I do not need one." Annie said, "I give you my name," he said, his voice raw. "I give you my land, my protection, my heart. It is all I have." "I give you my hands," she said, her voice trembling, but strong. "I give you this family. I am home. Levi, finally." Thomas stood beside Levi, holding his hat. Sarah stood beside her mother, clutching a handful of yellow sunflowers she had pulled. The wind, their only other witness, sighed through the pine branches. Levi leaned down and kissed his wife. It was not a kiss of passion or of grief. It was a kiss of beginning. It was a promise. They had been married a week. Life had settled into its new, official shape. Mr. and Mrs. Rollins. It felt strange and solid. And then the town came. It was not just the sheriff. It was a crowd. Levi saw them from the ridge, a group of 8 or 10 men on horseback. Preacher Gideon was at their head, his face a thundercloud. And with them, his face grim, was Sheriff Brody. Levi met them at the fence line, his rifle in his hand. Annie stood on the porch, watching. "Rollins!" Gideon shouted, pulling his horse up. "Your time is done. We are here, in the name of the church, to reclaim what is ours." "You are on my land. Preacher," Levi said, his voice calm. "State your business and leave." "Our business is justice. That woman, your harlot, has kept stolen church money. We are here to take it, and to take her to stand trial." "And," Gideon continued, "we are here to take back the land she has desecrated, the plot her shack stands on." "The money is here," Levi said. "You can have it, but you are not taking her, and you are not taking the land." He motioned to Annie. She came from the porch, carrying the rusted lockbox. She set it on the ground, a few feet from Gideon's horse. "There," Levi said. "Count it. It is all there." One of the elders dismounted, opened the box, and his eyes went wide. It is all here, preacher." Gideon smiled, a triumphant, ugly look. "So, she confesses. She is a thief." "She is a victim," Levi said, his voice hard. "But she is done paying for her husband's sins. Take the money, and go." "Not so fast," Gideon said, his zeal returning. "The money is ours, but so is the land. It was gifted to the church. We are here to claim it." "No," Levi said, "it was not." "Liar," one of the men shouted. "Sheriff," Levi said, ignoring the man, "do you uphold the law, or the word of this preacher?" "I uphold the law," Brody said, his voice tight. "Then uphold this." Levi reached into his shirt pocket. He pulled out the folded, official documents they had found in the bottom of the box. "This," he said, handing the first one to Brody, "is the original deed for that land, signed by Judge Miller 10 years ago, deeded to Jedediah Harper. He bought it." Brody unfolded it. He read it. His face was stone. "And this," Levi said, handing him the second document, "is the church's own ledger. The one you all claimed was stolen. Turn to the last page." Brody turned the page. "You'll see a record," Levi said, his voice carrying, "of a donation made by Jedediah Harper for $5, the same day the deed was signed.
He did not get the land from the church. He paid the church for a clear title. It was never your land. It was his, and now it belongs to his wife. Gideon's face went pale. His entire crusade, his righteous platform, had just evaporated. I do not care what some doctored papers say, a man yelled. The same one who had shouted before. We are here to run that woman out. The man's hand dropped to the pistol on his hip. Levi's rifle came up, smooth and level. But it was Brody's voice that cracked the air. Silas, do not! The sheriff had drawn his own pistol. He was not pointing it at Levi. He was pointing it at the crowd. What are you doing? Gideon sputtered. Brody, you are with us. No, preacher, Brody said, his voice clear and final. I am with the law. The money has been returned. The deed is clear, and I am holding in my pocket a marriage certificate, signed by me, in my office, 2 days ago. Mr. and Mrs. Rollins are legally wed. He turned his horse, blocking the path to the porch. There is no crime here. There is no church land. There is only a man and his wife on their own property. And all of you are trespassing. The crowd was stunned. They were defeated. They had no legal ground, no moral ground, and the law was not on their side. Get, Brody ordered. Go home. Gideon, his face purple with rage, stared at Levi. Levi just looked back, his rifle steady. Grumbling, cursing, the men turned their horses. They rode away, a defeated, angry pack. Sheriff Brody was the last to leave. He holstered his pistol. He looked at Levi, and then at Annie. Mr. Rollins, Mrs. Rollins, he said. He nodded once, a small, secret gesture of respect. The town, it will take time, but the law is satisfied. He turned and rode away, following the others. Levi stood, his rifle in his hand, until they were all just specks of dust in the valley. He finally lowered the gun. He turned. Annie was standing on the porch, her hands clasped at her chest. The war was over. They had won. He walked up the steps. He did not say a word. He just put his arms around her, pulling her tight. She leaned her head against his chest, her eyes closing, the tension of a year finally leaving her body. They stood on their porch, in the quiet, and for the first time, they were truly, finally, home. The summer's warmth bled away, replaced by the sharp, clean bite of autumn. The aspens on the hills turned a brilliant, painful yellow, then shed their leaves, leaving behind a skeleton landscape. Then the sky turned a flat, heavy gray, and the first snows came. Winter in the Montana high country did not arrive gently. It came like a judgment, a great white silence that swallowed the land, burying the fences and piling drifts as high as the cabin eaves. The world shrank to the small patch of land Levi kept clear with his shovel, the path from the cabin to the barn, the well, and the wood pile. Life became a matter of survival, a daily rotation of feeding the stock, splitting wood, and keeping the stove roaring against the cold that pressed in at the walls. But this winter was not like the others. Levi's cabin, once a bastion of cold solitude, was now full. It was full of the smell of Annie's baking bread, the steam from the laundry line strung across the room, and the low, constant murmur of voices. It was not easy. The cold was a physical enemy. The work was endless, but the silence was broken. The ranch, which the town of Two Forks had cast out, began to draw others who had been similarly discarded. It was not a plan. It just happened. The first was a man named Jonas. He had ridden with Levi's brother, Silas, before the war. He appeared one afternoon in a swirl of snow, his face a ruin of old scars from a cannon blast, his left arm missing below the elbow. He was starving, walking, and had nowhere to go. The war had taken his farm, and his family was gone. Levi found him in the barn, trying to steal an egg. Levi just looked at the man's desperate, haunted eyes, lowered his rifle, and said, "We are eating stew. You can have a bowl, and you can bunk in the barn, if you can mend harness with one hand." Jonas stayed. He was quiet, haunted by things he never spoke of, but his one hand was quick and strong. He was loyal to Levi, and he was gentle with the children, carving them small, perfect animals from scraps of firewood. The second came a month later. In the heart of a blizzard, a young woman, no older than 16, named Clara. She was pregnant, her belly a round, hard swell under her thin shawl. She had been a hired girl for a family in Two Forks, and when her condition became known, they had turned her out. Her own family had disowned her. She had walked 2 days in the snow, aiming for Levi's ranch. It had become a whisper, a last hope for those with no one else. She collapsed on their porch, half frozen, her labor already beginning. Annie took one look at her blue-tinged face, her eyes wide with terror, and her own past rose up. This was a different kind of poverty, but the same desperation. "Bring her in," she ordered Levi, her voice firm. "Now, put her by the fire. Thomas, fetch the clean blankets. All of them." For 2 days, Annie and Levi fought for her life. The storm howled outside, a white, screaming rage, while inside, Annie held Clara's hand, wiping her brow, her voice the low, steady comfort Levi had once heard by the fence line. Clara gave birth to a small, healthy girl. The cabin was now crowded. Levi, Annie, and the children. Jonas, who ate with them but still slept in the barn. And now Clara, with her newborn, occupying the pallet by the stove where Annie had once slept. The town, when they heard, was scandalized. Levi Rollins' ranch was not just a home of sin, it was a refuge for it, a den of thieves, harlots, and broken soldiers. They were a blot on the landscape, an island of outcasts. Annie, however, had never felt more at home. She had been the preacher's daughter, and now she finally understood what that meant. It was not about judgment, it was about grace. Her garden was buried under 4 feet of snow, but her purpose was clear. Other isolated homesteads, ones who also distrusted the sharp-tongued righteousness of Two Forks, had heard of her. One Sunday, a neighboring rancher, a quiet man with 3 small children and a wife who could not read, rode over. "Mrs. Rollins," he said, twisting his hat in his hands. We heard you can read, that you are learned." "I can read," Annie said. "Our children, the wife and I, we was wondering if you might teach them their letters. We can pay in smoked hams." And so, every Sunday, the barn became a school. Levi would clear the center, and Annie would set up a plank on 2 barrels. Her own children, the neighbors' 3, and even Jonas, who confessed he only knew his name, would sit on hay bales. Annie, using an old Bible and a few almanacs, would teach them. She taught them to read, to write their names, to do sums. She was patient, her voice clear. Levi would stand in the back, leaning against a post, pretending to oil a harness. He would watch her, a quiet pride swelling in his chest. She had taken the judgment of the town and turned it into a light. He watched her constantly. He saw how hard she worked, keeping the cabin fed, mended, and clean. He saw her rocking Clara's new baby, lulling the infant to sleep when the young mother was too exhausted. She always sat on a hard, 3-legged stool, her back straight, but he could see the weariness in her shoulders. He began to work in the barn at night, by lantern light. After the children were asleep, Jonas would watch, handing him tools with his one good hand. Levi was not a carpenter, but he was patient. He worked on it for a week. He took a piece of solid, smooth-grained pine. He carved, he sanded, he measured. He worked until the wood was as smooth as river stone. He built it to last. One night, Annie was scrubbing the stew pot, her back aching, her hands raw from the lye soap. Levi came in from the barn. He was carrying it. It was a rocking chair. It was simple, solid, and beautiful. The arms were worn smooth, the rockers perfectly curved. Annie dropped the rag. She put her wet hands to her mouth.
I figured,
Levi said, his voice gruff, embarrassed by the vulnerability of the gift.
You needed a place to sit.
She walked over to it. She touched the wood. It was still warm from his hands. She looked at him, her eyes shining with tears. It was not a grand gift. It was not jewelry or silk. It was better. It was a chair. It was rest. It was his time, his hands, his thought, all carved into wood.
Levi,
she whispered. She did not have the words. Try it, he said. She sat. She put her feet up, and the chair rocked. A smooth, gentle, perfect motion. She closed her eyes, and a single tear of gratitude rolled down her cheek. She was not a beggar. She was not a burden. She was a woman with her own rocking chair, built by her husband. That night, the children were asleep. Clara and the baby were quiet. Jonas was in the barn. The cabin was peaceful. The only sounds, the crackle of the fire and the howl of the wind outside. Annie sat in her chair, rocking slowly. Levi was on the hearth, cleaning a buckle.
Levi,
she said, her voice quiet. Do you ever regret it? He stopped his work. He knew what she meant. The day in the pantry, the fight with Sloane, the sheriff, the town. He looked at her face soft in the firelight, her hands resting in her lap. She was no longer the hollow-eyed, terrified woman he had found. She was strong. She was beautiful. She was the heart of his home. He put the buckle down. He went to her, kneeling by the side of the chair. He took her hand.
Annie,
he said, his voice low and certain.
I only have one regret.
She looked at him, her eyes searching his. I regret, he said, that I did not ride into that pantry 5 years sooner. I regret every day you were in that shack, every meal you missed, every time you were cold. That is what I regret. Only that I did not do it sooner. He kissed her hand, a simple, profound gesture. She leaned from the chair and kissed his forehead, the last of her fear, the small, cold stone that had remained in her heart, finally, completely, melted away. The next afternoon, the cold broke for a few hours, and Levi took Thomas to the barn to repair a snowshoe. The boy, who was now 6, was a solid, capable child. He was Levi's shadow, mirroring his walk, his quiet way of watching. Levi was cutting a new leather strap, and Thomas was holding the frame steady. It is hard to pull it tight, Levi said, more to himself than the boy. Here, Thomas said, shifting his grip. I've got it. Levi pulled the strap through. Good, you are strong. Hand me the awl. Yes, Pa. The word was simple. It was natural. It was not planned. Levi's hands froze. The leather strap fell from his grasp. He felt the word hit him, not like a sound, but like a physical blow, right in the center of his chest. It knocked the breath from him. What did you say? He whispered, his back still to the boy. The awl, Thomas said, confused.
Here it is. Pa, are you all right?
Levi took the awl, his hand shaking. He could not speak. He could not turn. He had been a man alone. He had been a brother who had failed. He had been a husband. He had never, ever been Pa. He stood up, his throat thick. I need to check the wind, the snow. Stay here. He walked out of the barn, into the blinding white light of the snow-covered yard. He walked until he was behind the woodpile, where the cabin could not see him. He leaned his forehead against the rough, frozen logs, and for the first of time since his brother's hanging, he cried. They were not the tears of grief. They were the tears of a frozen thing, a deep, barren part of his soul, finally thawing. He, Levi Rollins, the outcast, the silent, scarred man. He had a son. He stayed there until the cold bit at his cheeks and the tears froze. He wiped his face, took a deep, steadying breath, and walked back into the barn. "All right," he said, his voice rough. "Let us fix this shoe, son." The winter was long. The ranch was still an island. The judgment from Two Forks never truly went away. It was a cold, bitter line drawn around their land. But inside that line, they were not just surviving, they were living. The cabin was a world unto itself. It was loud, it was crowded, it was warm. In the evenings, Jonas would tell stories of the war, his voice a low rumble. Annie would read to the children. Clara would sing a soft lullaby to her baby. And Levi would sit at the table, his hand resting on Annie's as she mended. And he would just listen. The land was still harsh, the snow was bitter, but inside, they were safe. One night, the worst storm of the winter descended. It was a true blizzard, a howling white darkness that erased the world. The wind shrieked, and the cabin shuddered under the assault. Inside, the fire roared. They were all there, gathered close. Clara was nursing the baby. Jonas was half asleep by the hearth. The children were in their bed, already asleep. Annie sat in her rocking chair, a blanket over her lap. She was not rocking the baby. The infant was asleep in her cradle. She was just rocking, listening to the storm. "It is a bad one," Levi said, securing the latch on the door. "We are safe," Annie murmured, her eyes on the fire. "We are warm." He came and sat on the stool near her. He took her hand. They sat in a comfortable, deep silence, the storm raging outside, their small, warm world holding fast against it. Hours passed. The storm did not let up. Levi dozed, his head against the log wall. He woke, the fire burning low. He looked over. Annie was still in the chair, but she had fallen asleep. Her head was tilted, her breathing deep and even, her face peaceful in the flickering light. He watched her for a long time. He saw the woman from the pantry, the mother who fought the wind, the wife who had stood barefoot in the garden. He saw his home. He stood, his joints stiff. He went to the cradle and tucked the blanket tighter around Clara's baby. He added a large log to the fire, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. Then he went to his wife. He slid his arms under her, one beneath her knees, the other around her back. He lifted her. She was light. She stirred, murmuring in her sleep, and her head fell, naturally, to rest on his chest. Her hand came up to curl against his shirt. He stood there for a moment, holding her, the heart of his life in his arms. The wind howled, but he barely heard it. He carried her to their bed. He pulled back the thick quilts and gently laid her down. He pulled her boots off, and then tucked the blankets around her, tight and warm. She was home. She was safe. He stood, looking down at her, his heart so full he thought it might break. He leaned down, his lips brushing her hair. "You're home now," he whispered, his voice thick against the sound of the storm. "Always. Thank you for listening to our story. We would love to hear from you, so please comment where you are listening from and connect with others. Do not forget to subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts.